Hi everyone, my name is Natalie Snodgrass. Today I'm going to be talking about research methodologies for designing in non-native scripts. I'll be going over some highlights in my research, a brief overview of background information, surveys, and interviews, which all leads up to a final framework that can guide a designer on the research process. So what are the questions that drove this research? First, how does one become prepared to design an effective and well-researched typeface in an unfamiliar script? And by unfamiliar, I mean one the designer cannot read or write in, maybe a script from a culture that they are not native to, or a script whose cultural context they are unfamiliar with. Second, how does the designer's understanding of the relationship between type and culture affect this research process? And third, does the use of traditional anthropological research methods increase the success of this design process? If so, to what extent? So here's an overview of the entire research methodology for this project, but today I'll be sharing some quick highlights from the secondary research, interviews and surveys, and then going over the final framework in depth. So to start off, typography is always a responsive environment, meaning that typographic form only has meaning when viewed within a culture, and it's constantly in response to different cultural contexts and individuals' perspectives. With that in mind, it becomes imperative to understand the community you're designing for and the nuances of its subcultures. Within cultural studies and related to the concept of cultural identity, we have the idea of the postmodern subject, that modern individuals have no permanent identity. It shifts as we age, with whom we associate, our interests, settings, and all cultural interactions. In this diagram called the web of identity, we can see all of the different cultural identities we as individuals have. This web of identity is what allows for rich typographic tradition and variation within every culture. Typographic form shifts with different cultural and sociological identities, and it can be used as an indicator of one or more of those identities. Within this work, it's also important to study the systems of production and consumption within the new culture. This diagram, called the systems of production and consumption, shows how artifacts pass through the different areas of a culture. So typography as an artifact that passes through production, consumption, regulation, representation, and identity, it carries with it only constructed meanings of culture that it picks up in each of these phases. We then investigate these areas of culture through anthropological acts like participant field observation, interaction with locals, visits to locality, interviews, and more, and variations on these methods can be seen across many areas of design research. I conducted interviews with 8 type designers who collectively have expertise in over 20 world scripts. The goal of these interviews, as well as the surveys that I'll discuss next, was to better understand how practicing multi-script type designers conduct research and become informed about writing systems. Additionally, how the different cultural structures surrounding typography influence their processes. One of the most important discussions in these interviews was on the limitations to the multi-script type design process. These are the types of roadblocks that a designer faces when starting a project in a non-native script. First, the pragmatic is a lack of access to or difficulty in acquiring reference materials. This can be especially difficult when dealing with minority scripts. Second, linguistic, which is a lack of background knowledge on the language for which the script is used. Third, the psychological is the designer's own preconceptions and unconscious biases on language, typography, and culture. And fourth is the methodical, wherein the designer may feel like they can treat the type design process as the graphic design process, when in fact these two are incredibly different. In the process of creating typefaces in a non-native script, interviewees noted that 90% of time is spent with research and only about 10% is spent actually designing. One is constantly referring back to their research and continuing with research throughout the design process. Next, this chart illustrates the type of resources participants used during their research in both the interview and survey results. The majority of respondents used forms of printed matter as their main source of research material. And you can see the least used forms of research materials are things like stone carvings, metal type or wood type. This can suggest that convenience and availability are important factors when gathering materials, but may also denote the reliability or trustworthiness of different sources over others. Overall, within all interview participants' process was this underlying structure going from open discovery and critical analysis onto designing. This allows for a thorough evaluation and synthesis of complex writing systems. Also, many participants noted the vital importance of learning how to write in the script that you are studying and to participate with traditional tools. This allows the designer to literally feel and experience the system of writing different from their own and break down some of their own preconceptions. And finally, all participants have conducted audience research where they maintain correspondence, test their work, or work collaboratively with native speakers, representatives, clients, or designers, which tells us that anthropological methods are an imperative tool in typeface design research. Next, a survey was conducted that had a total of 57 participants from over 13 countries and with expertise in 24 scripts. So when asked what are some of the arguments for and against designing in a non-native script, proponents stated that it can push the designer into new areas of typographic understanding. It can help the designer to better understand challenges facing other cultures, and it can present opportunities to help underserved groups. Skeptics really emphasized the large amount of commitment required for learning a new script properly and showed hesitation to impose an incomplete understanding onto communities that may have unforeseen consequences in the future. The most frequently used ethnographic research methods within the survey respondents is observation of type in use, followed by sharing of process with local readers or experts, and then field work or visits to locality. Respondents also feel the most comfortable designing in a new script once they're familiar with the script structure, and also when they have the ability to define shape group behaviors and the ability to recognize meaningful details in shapes. Overall, the goal of research in non-native scripts is to become familiar with how a script is adapted across different purposes and artifacts, and how these artifacts and their typographic representations are connected to that culture's identity and history. Most importantly, the underlying commonality of all this information, both interviews and surveys, is the participants have this notion of respect, that a designer is showing humility and sensitively responding to the nuances of a given script's cultural context and providing a typographic product that's accurate to the forms, history, and usage of the script. So all this information culminates in a final framework that presents a groundwork structure for designers looking to navigate the process of learning to design in a new script. Here we have the main framework diagram. As you can see, this framework takes a decentralized model where the designer can enter the process at whichever point their knowledge level necessitates. However, if a person wants to start from the quote-unquote beginning, it would be at script research and working their way around clockwise. It's also non-specific to any one script, allowing for anyone to utilize this process for any project. So you can see that it's broken up into 4 stages, including 3 stages for research: script, context, and client. So script research is research on the script's history, construction, and shape language. Context research is research on how the script is used and applied by that cultural group or community. And client research is research on the client brief and on the needs of that particular context. These areas are all investigated through 3 different research methods: observation, interaction and practicing, and critical analysis. And you can see these methods exist on the lines guiding across all subject areas. First, observation is any removed act of observation where the designer isn't physically interacting with this system of culture, but rather observing the use, application, or forms of the script. Second, interaction and practicing means any direct interaction a researcher may have with a script or a community, including interviews and soliciting feedback from readers or practicing to write in that script. And finally, we have the method of critical analysis, which highlights the fact that one must constantly be asking questions at every point of research: why the forms are that way, why the people behave that way, how that script has evolved, etc., and to be hyper aware of all the processes they go through, analyzing their own questions, reactions, and perspectives. All this information then feeds into the design process, which in this framework is extremely simplified. We have these steps of concept, digitize, and test. Every script shares these design steps, but each script has their own idiosyncratic pattern with each phase. So this design step then feeds back into the research process in a never-ending, iterative, informative loop. And because each of these research areas, script, context, and client, are so complex in their own rights, we have supporting diagrams to help guide you through them. So first is script research. This diagram outlines the resources that a designer may pull on when researching the constructions and forms of a script. First, we can see printed matter, which includes artifacts like densely typeset documents that allow someone to understand the grammar, the spacing, the overall texture of a script. Or you could look at something like printed ephemera, which can act as a ground zero to the graphic design and type styling of a culture. Next is environmental resources, which is any typographic artifact that exists within the built environment. Things like vernacular typography, signage, or graffiti. Third is online resources, which is any digital reference. So Unicode charts and proposals can be very valuable to study, particularly for minority scripts where information is sparse. Open source font files can be useful, opening those up and studying the decisions that the type designer made. And finally, historical resources. When one needs to study the history of a script, they can look to manuscripts, traditional calligraphy, surfaces like moving type, engraving, stone carving, which all paint a story of the evolution of form. Next is context research. What are some points that need to be studied in relation to that culture and in relation to that culture's cycle of production and consumption, remembering the sociological discussion that was shared at the beginning of this presentation. This diagram outlines the areas of the cultural context that a designer should consider when researching typography. First is vernacular typography and graphic styles. What do these forms mean or suggest or signify, and why do they suggest those things? Next, forms and habits of written communication and audience reader habits. How do people write and read in that culture? Standards of technology usage. What types of technologies are available or are the norm in that culture, and how do they affect your font file and structure? System of document production. How are typographic artifacts created, shared, consumed? And finally, issues of colonialism in relation to type. How have other groups imposed their ways of thinking onto that script, and what effects has that had? This is a particularly important item to consider when thinking about that concept of respect for that community. How has the script and language been altered in the past? How has this affected the minute details of their typographic practices? And how do the answers to these questions inform your own design choices, behaviors, and investigations? And finally, we have the supporting diagram for client research. These questions should be asked in addition to all of the traditional client brief information. First, which languages need to be covered, and how can the forms work cohesively while remaining true to their own culture and history? This is a basic question to any multi-script project and speaks to the base nature of multi-script practices. Next, what are the circumstances of the readers and how will that affect technical choices, i.e. font features, file size, etc. Don't take your own technological privileges for granted. It's important to recognize the resources available to that particular audience and how your font and typeface can fit into that community effectively and pragmatically. Which brings me to the next question. How can you exploit new technology to benefit the reader and the script? Are there creative ways you can use type design software to benefit this project, this audience, this community? For example, things like open type features, variable fonts, etc. And finally, what does your character set need to include? Are there language-specific glyph variations that need to be covered? Are there any particular dialects that require unique glyphs or variations? So just to take it back to the main framework, we can see how interconnected all of these elements of information are, how they all feed into one another. It's so important to understand the context of the typographic forms you're playing with, and the outlining of this process is the first step in thwarting any misinformation and allowing design to flourish. So I just want to leave you with one last thought, which was raised during an interview. Typeface design is a knowledge profession. Increasingly, being able to make a typeface doesn't distinguish anyone. The understanding of how to make a typeface that represents the needs of a community and captures a trend, that is what you'd build a career on. In all of the explored avenues of discussion on research, we can see that anthropological research methods are already used across many areas of typographic research. Without this type of research, there are large gaps that exist in a designer's understanding of native use, application, readership, and cultural context. It's in the recognition and the pointed application of these acts where the designer's new work can begin to flourish, and it's in the empathy and respect for cultures where the work is successful and lasting. Thank you for your time, and I just want to include this link below too if you're interested in reading the full research document. There's so much more in this process that I didn't have time to discuss today. Thank you.